Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Lydia, I use the pronouns she and her, and I'm a queer, bisexual woman. I've not always been confident enough to state that unequivocally. Even just a few years ago, I would never have put myself forward for an opportunity like this. And honestly, even now, there's a tiny voice in the back of my head saying that mine is not a voice that people will be interested in hearing, that I should not be taking up this space. But how queer do you have to be queer enough for your community? And who gets to decide? Despite being lucky enough to have been born into an incredibly supportive family, I didn't discuss sexuality with them growing up. One of the reasons for that was the lack of representation of bisexuality that existed when I was in high school. I thought I could either be straight or lesbian, but I didn't really feel like I was either. When I was younger, I told myself, everyone has crushes on girls. That doesn't mean you're gay. You definitely like boys, so you're still straight. 10 years ago, at university in the UK, I knew I wasn't heterosexual, but I didn't really understand or have the language to put together what I was feeling. My housemates at the time were a gay man and a lesbian couple. In those moments, surrounded by people who seemed to understand their own sexuality far more than me, I felt unsure of my own identity. How could I possibly be queer and so out of place there with them? My first long-term relationship was with the man who is now my husband. As a bisexual in a straight-passing relationship, I have often found myself asking, am I queer enough? And if you are part of the LGBTQ+ community, chances are these thoughts have probably crossed your mind at some point too. I spent a lot of time not claiming my queerness. I felt like I shouldn't take up space in the LGBTQ+ community because people would see how inexperienced I was, or I'd be found out for being a fake because I was in a long-term other-sex relationship. My experience is common within the bisexual community. A survey by the Pew Research Centre showed more than 80% of us find ourselves in other-sex relationships, dating cis men or women, in spite of our attraction to cis persons of the same gender, trans and non-binary individuals. But still, my queerness is looked at by some as lesser than or performative because of my relationship with a cis man. On the flip side, some people see my bisexuality as confusing or threatening. They wonder how I can possibly be in a fulfilling relationship with a cis man if I am also attracted to other genders. The validity of my identity is therefore always in question. If I'm not gay enough and I'm not straight enough, then what am I? The things that pushed me to finally accept myself as a bisexual woman were making amazing and supportive queer and queer ally friends. I talked to other bisexuals and realised all of our experiences were wildly different, and that was okay. I realise now that the reason I was having so many doubts about belonging in this community growing up was because I hadn't heard enough voices like my own. I was heavily influenced by the poor representation of the LGBTQ+ community in the media. I didn't see enough people speaking up about bisexuality not being any less queer than any other identity. I cannot contend to have a definitive knowledge of what it means to be queer, or even for that matter, what it means to be bisexual. I acknowledge my extreme privilege in being white, cisgender, and straight passing. But what I do know is queer means different things to different people. Of course, it's not only those who are attracted to a gender other than their own, like bisexual or pansexual folks, who experience feeling not queer enough. And it's not only tied to sexual orientation. So this is for all the queer folks who aren't out right now, who are partially out, who are struggling with their queerness, to queer folks that haven't had the chance to explore their sexuality or gender identity because of homophobia, biphobia, or transphobia. There is no singular right way to be queer. I'm 30 now. When I was a kid, queer was a derogatory term. This is part of the term's history. It was, and in some cases still is, a word used to hurt us that has been reclaimed. Language evolves with society, often due to the tireless work of those who want to see a change. Such is the case for queer, a term now predominantly used by the LGBTQ+ community as an umbrella term for being outside of mainstream heteronormative society. The word queer is one of the only identifiers in our community that is not explicitly defined. I find it beautiful in its very lack of definition, because it has the ability to represent a multitude of different identities. It is expansive enough to allow for all kinds of differences in experience and expression. To me, queer conveys both an orientation and a sense of community. It is meant to be inclusive and create a sense of acceptance. We exist on a spectrum, and anyone who identifies within that spectrum shouldn't feel the need to qualify their experience or prove that they are enough. I wish I could have told myself this years ago. If you are seeking to actively affirm and celebrate your queer identity and connect with the queer community, some of the things I found valuable were engaging in activism on queer issues, staying connected to my queer friends, and intentionally consuming media by and about queer people. Remember, there is no set aesthetic to queerness. Although media portrayals of queer characters often lean into stereotypes, queerness is not supposed to look a certain way. One way I remind myself that queerness doesn't have one particular look is by filling my social feeds with queer folks. Consuming content from people with a variety of experiences, looks, and relationship configurations affirms that there is no cookie cutter for the queer experience. Reading books and watching films and TV shows that feature queer characters can also be a powerful way to stay connected to our identities. Unfortunately, despite increasing visibility and representation, it's not always easy to find media that portrays queer characters realistically and three-dimensionally. An annual report by GLAAD found that only 9.1% of characters scheduled to appear on primetime broadcast series identified as LGBTQ+ in the 2021 season. The GLAAD Media Awards list can point you in the direction of some shows that do get it right. And hey, if you work in the media and publishing industry and you see this, remember that one LGBTQ+ character among a group of several straight cisgender characters doesn't cut it anymore. We want stories with depth and nuance, and characters that reflect the full diversity of our community. If we, as a community, embrace the vastness of identities that might exist outside the heterosexual norm, we can empower others to claim their queerness, even if it's just a feeling inside them, something they do not know how to define yet. Instead of worrying about gatekeeping queer communities, let's work to accept ourselves and each other fully. There are as many ways to identify as queer as there are people who do. So if you feel that you may be queer and you want to own that, then you will always be queer enough.